Principles of practice, how to conduct proper investigative interviews and interrogations. Since 1947, John Reed and Associates has been conducting investigative interviews and, when appropriate, interrogations. And for the last 50 plus years, we've been teaching investigators around the world these principles of practice in terms of conducting proper interviews and interrogations. Our purpose in this presentation is to reinforce the core principles of practice that we feel are essential in conducting effective interviews and interrogations. This is not designed to train you on how to do interviews or interrogations, but to emphasize the core elements in the practice of conducting interviews and interrogations. So let's start by looking at the essential elements of the investigative interview process. Our initial contact with the subject, unless there's some life-saving circumstance involved, should be a non-accusatory, non-confrontational interview. All interviews should be conducted in accordance with the guidelines established by the courts, such as the appropriate advisement of rights, the presence of a parent or guardian for the questioning of a minor, etc. Throughout the interview process, the interrogator should maintain a neutral, objective, fact-finder demeanor. During the interview, the investigator should not engage in any kind of accusatory or confrontational behavior. The interview typically begins with some casual conversation. It might be biographical information, what the subject does for a living. We might talk about something current in the news, the big game yesterday, things of that nature. The purpose of which is to acclimate the subject to the interview process, to develop rapport with the subject, and to develop the subject's behavioral baseline or norm so we can see if there's any changes from that as the interview progresses. The investigator should use open-ended questions to develop the subject's statement, story, version of events, or explanation of what happened. We follow what we call the 80-20 rule. In the interview, the investigator should do about 20% of the talking, and the subject should do about 80%. We have two videos on the topic of using open-ended questions, parts 1 and 2, which I recommend that you review at your convenience. During the interview, the investigator should observe the subject's verbal and nonverbal behaviors as a guide for the interview questions. For example, if we see behavior suggesting when the subject may be editing an answer, perhaps fabricating a response or withholding information, it might suggest the need for appropriate follow-up questions to maybe ask more about that same topic. It's important to remember that there is no behavior unique to deception. Behavior has to be evaluated in both context and against the subject's normal behavioral baseline. Some people say, for example, that if somebody doesn't look at you when they answer a question, they're lying. Well, that's ridiculous. There's all kinds of reasons a person may not look at us. They're distracted. There's a psychological issue, maybe a cultural consideration. They're thinking about something, trying to remember something, etc. There are numerous factors that can affect a subject's behavior during the interview, including culture, mental and psychological impairments, physical condition, the presence of drugs or alcohol, etc., all of which the investigator must consider in the evaluation of the subject during the interview process. One of our video presentations on the YouTube channel is called "There's No Behavior Unique to Lying," and it gets into much more detail at evaluating behavior during the interview process. A subject's verbal and nonverbal behaviors are not a substitute for evidence, but can be helpful in identifying when a subject may be less than candid during the interview, prompting us to ask additional questions, which in turn may lead to the discovery of additional incriminating facts or evidence. Once the investigator hears the subject's story and has questioned the subject about their story, we should evaluate it to see if it is consistent with our case, facts, and evidence. And if during the subject's statement he offers an alibi, we certainly want to try to check that out to determine if it's in fact accurate. A general interviewing principle to keep in mind is that we should not tell the subject what we already know. Rather, we want to ask them questions to see if what they tell us is consistent with what we know, or if in fact the information we have actually contradicts what they're telling us. One of our video presentations is called "Do Not Tell the Subject What You Know," and gets into this principle in much greater detail. The investigator should utilize two primary types of questions in the interview: investigative and behavior provoking. Investigative questions are your typical who, what, when, where, why type of questions, which we all ask. Behavior provoking questions are questions we know from experience and from research that most truthful people answer one way, most deceptive people answer a different way. We have a video presentation called "The Value of Behavior Provoking Questions," a case study on the YouTube channel that you should take a look at. It'll give you the example, I think, of 5 behavior provoking questions that you can incorporate in your interviews. It's important during the interview process that the investigator does not reveal all of the case details to the subject, because we want to maybe use some of those details later on if the subject confesses, to verify the fact that he's telling us the truth and he has firsthand knowledge of the details about the crime. And that's one of the reasons you don't want to show the subject photographs of the crime scene that in and of themselves may reveal some of the details you would like to keep secret. At the conclusion of the interview, we're going to evaluate the subject's possible involvement in the issue that's under investigation based on the investigation, the case facts, the factual evidence we've developed, and information developed during the interview process. If our conclusion, based on the interview process, the case facts, and the case evidence, is that this is the probable subject who committed the act that is under investigation, we will then move into the interrogation process. Here are the essential elements of that. Interrogations should only occur when the case investigative information indicates the subject's probable involvement in the commission of the crime. We're not interrogating people at random. We're only doing it when the evidence is pointing to them. The purpose of the interrogation is to learn the truth, which may or may not be a confession. Some people in the interrogation will tell you that, look, I didn't do it, but okay, I know who did. Or they may give some other acknowledgement that they lied about an alibi or something like that. The investigators should conduct all interrogations in accordance with the guidelines established by the courts, including the advisement of rights, the presence of a parent or guardian for a minor, etc. The investigator should always treat the subject with dignity and respect throughout the process. The investigator should not make any promises of leniency, threats of harm, or threats of inevitable consequences, or in any way physically abuse the subject, all of which many of the courts will view as coercive elements. The investigators should not conduct interrogations for an excessively lengthy period of time. When you look at the body of false confession cases, many of them came after 16 or 17 hours of continuous questioning. We are not recommending that. The investigators should never deny the subject any of their rights. And if the subject's been with us for some bit of time, we should never deny them the chance to satisfy their physical needs, such as using the washroom, getting something to eat or drink, etc. And in a non-custodial interrogation where the person is there of their own free will, it's important we do not deprive them of the opportunity to leave the room. If they want to get up and walk out, that's up to them. The investigator should also exercise cautions when interviewing socially immature juveniles or individuals with mental or psychological impairments. And with these subjects, we do not lie to them about evidence in the case. And that's also true if a subject has little or no memory for the time period when the crime was committed, maybe due to alcohol or drugs. Again, with that kind of individual, we do not want to lie to them about evidence in the case. The investigator should begin the interrogation process with a statement of involvement. Charlie, the results of the investigation clearly indicate you set fire to this building. Following that initial statement, the investigator then engages in a monologue presentation, which we call a theme, in which we propose to the subject reasons and motives that will serve to psychologically justify or excuse their behavior. Not legally justify or excuse, but psychologically. Typically, the investigator attempts to shift some of the blame for what the subject did onto some person or set of circumstances other than the suspect himself, building the subject up as a good, honest, hardworking person who made a mistake in judgment due to his friend talking him into it, the financial pressures he was facing, etc. We get into this idea of developing the theme in much greater detail in two of our video presentations, Positive Persuasion and Projection and Rationalization. The focus of theme development is on why the suspect committed the act, not if, because what did we say when we came in? We said the results of the investigation clearly indicate that you did do this. When the subject appears ready to tell the truth, when they've made the decision to tell us what they've done, the easiest way to open that door is through the use of what's called an alternative question. Johnny, was this the first time you did something like this, or has it happened many times before? When a subject acknowledges what they did, the investigator should ask open-ended questions to develop corroborating information, corroborating details. The location of the murder weapon or bloody clothes, how the subject gained entry into the building, where the subject sold the stolen jewelry, that kind of information. Corroboration is an essential element to establish the authenticity of the subject's statement. The interview and interrogation should both be recorded, primarily to document what was done and said, and also to provide protection for the investigator against false claims by the subject that the investigator engaged in some inappropriate behavior. Keep in mind, the subject's confession is not the end of the investigation. The investigator should continue to develop additional details about the subject's behavior before and after the crime, and to verify the details of the statement itself. Another video on the YouTube channel you might want to review is the value of recording interrogations. If you missed any information from this presentation, the investigator tip that is dated April 25th, 2022 on our website, which is, of course, read.com, contains all the information we just went through, so that'll be a resource for you to access. And there are other resources I want to bring to your attention. In terms of false confession issues, we have a video presentation, parts 1 and 2, with an accompanying document on our website. It's an investigator tip dated June 1st of 2021. So you can download that. You can watch the video as well. We have a video presentation called What Questions Should Be Asked to Determine the Voluntariness and Validity of a Subject's Confession. And at read.com, we have an investigator tip that details all of the questions that you'll hear in the video program. We also have a video called Clarifying Misrepresentations of Law Enforcement Interrogation Techniques, and an accompanying document as well that you can download. Many social psychologists, defense attorneys, academicians misrepresent what law enforcement do when they conduct interviews or interrogations, and this video and document address those misrepresentations and talks about what the actual cases might be, what they are actually taught, what they're taught not to do, etc. So it's a good piece, particularly if you anticipate testifying on a confession. Thank you very much for taking a few minutes to listen to this video presentation. I hope you have the chance to see a few of the others that I mentioned during the program. Thanks again.